Jack Loeffler is an American oral historian, radio producer, writer, and environmentalist. He is known for his work documenting the culture and ecology of the American Southwest. He was Edward Abbeys' best friend. I had the honor and privilege of interviewing him in his home in Durango, Colorado in December 2023. He was 87 years old at the time of this interview. This interview is comprised of 7 questions broken up into 11 parts into a single YouTube playlist. The full interview is also in the playlist, but will be released last. Jack is full of wisdom, and I did my best to let him speak freely without boundaries during our 3-hour conversation. Given this dynamic, Jack provided long, winding answers to my questions as he reflected back on his life. With that, let's get to the interview.
All right.
Ed never owned a camera.
Oh, yeah. But there's not that many photos of him. Yeah. Okay, you right? Well, actually, I want to just speak to that for a little bit before I get into this. His writing was the camera.
Yeah.
You know, like his imagery was on his. You're transported to this place, and it's like magic.
Oh, he was an amazing writer.
And that's the difference between him and someone like me. Like, someone reads my work, and it's like, if I write something, it's like a camping story, and for him, it's very moving, and I can feel what it's like to be there, and that's, going back to Desert Solitary as an example, like that book was based off journals he wrote in 1956 that were published around 10 years later, and definitely had a profound impact on me.
Yeah, hugely beautiful book.
And just steering my life towards this place. So, and the desert in general. Okay, last question on it. You write about your part in executing Ed's final wishes to be buried out in the desert by his closest friends. In short, after your friend passed away, you took him to an undisclosed desert location where he felt connected to the earth for interment without asking permission from any government organizations. This was his wish. This story is one of a kind, and most people would never do this type of thing, even for their best friend. What led to this level of friendship and camaraderie with Ed?
Wow, well, about somewhere in the early 70s, we were camped up in the Piceance Basin, where they wanted to shoot off atomic bombs to make pockets of oil.
Oh my gosh.
And Ed was supposed to be writing an article about that, but we took a hike one night and got into our normal conversational mode. And at one point he stopped on the trail and said, "Jack," which is the way he always prefaced it. And then, "Would you agree," or words to this effect, "to bury me if I die before you, if I guarantee you that I'll bury you if you die before me?" And so we made a vow that night. And it was a hard duty vow, I'll tell you. We really looked into each other's eyes big time.
Mm-hmm.
And because this was huge trust. But we had that. And we agreed to it. And that was how that came about. And part of it had to do with not dying in a hospital. Jesus busted him out of the hospital 2 times in 10 days. The first time, he thought he was dying and he didn't want to be in the hospital anyway. He'd had a bleed. And so I stole a wheelchair from this woman's room in the hospital and put Ed in it and wheeled him out of the hospital. And Clark, his wife, or his widow now, was running interference for me, and I drove away like mad and got him out of the hospital then.
Is Clark passed away? So...
No, she's alive.
Okay.
She refuses to be
Right.
interviewed.
Right, okay.
And no, she remains a dear friend.
Mm-hmm.
We're in contact. And she's remarried. And she and my wife were close, very close friends. But Ed, some years later, a good decade later, probably, I had two houses, the one that my wife and I first built, and then when it got too crowded, we sold that place and bought a place out more in the country. But when we were still in that house, in the canyon in Santa Fe, Ed and Clark and Susie, I think Susie was with them, came by to visit. And Ed had wanted to see if I knew of a doctor because he had a pain in his gut. And curiously, the guy who was my doctor at that time and myself were running the Rio Chama, which is a neat little run, beautiful run. And so I got home and there were the Abbeys staying with us. And Ed was saying, I got this pain in my gut. They'd been up in near Great Sand Dunes, National Monument, over in the San Luis Valley, where he was in a borrowed cabin from Jim Carrico. He borrowed a cabin to write, I don't know what he was writing, Good News? Anyway, whatever it was. But anyway, later that afternoon, he keeled over in pain in the living room. And so Clark and I hauled him off to the hospital. This is after Ed and I made the vow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we checked him into the hospital. We always had a bit of gallows humor going, no matter what.
Right.
The first thing that happened was I was at the desk doing some paperwork on Ed's behalf, and some nurse came up and started to roll up my sleeve. And I said, what are you doing? She said, well, Mr. Abbey. And I said, us guys with beards all look alike. He was considerably taller. He was 6'3". In those days, I was about 5'11". I've shrunk. But anyway, a doctor came in, a specialist came in, and diagnosed Ed with pancreatic cancer with 2 months to live. And I looked at him and said, well, I'm here for your disposal. And he turned and looked at me and he said, well, at least I don't have to floss anymore. And but I was letting him know that whatever went down.
Yeah.
And he knew it. And then finally we talked him into getting another medical opinion. It was a trip getting everybody back down to Tucson. Clark and Susie were going to drive back to Tucson, and their truck broke down in Albuquerque, fortunately. It broke down there, and they got a motel room, and I was going to have taken Ed to the airport the next day to get him to fly down there in case he had some sort of a whatever. And so kind of remember all of this stuff. I had a pickup truck in those days, and I went in a tow bar that I got from another guy I buried named John Muir, the guy who did the book on how to fix a VW for the complete idiot.
Okay.
And
Did you bury him before or after Abbey?
before.
Okay, so was it the same sort of deal?
Well, that was a slightly different one, but it was illegal.
But similar idea.
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay. I did not expect this was going to go this way. So how many people have you buried? It's just the two?
And then a bunch of ashes, but
Oh yeah.
the only two bodies that I've hauled away.
Okay. Oh my gosh.
Which to me, law has nothing to do with it as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
Human law and natural law do not coincide on many fronts. But anyway, I drove down and I hooked up. I took Ed and Kath. She came with me, my wife. And we put Ed and Clark together on a plane, and Susie, and they flew down to Tucson. And I hooked up this tow bar that I gotten from John, who had been dead a good fight. He died in 77 and pulled their truck down to Ed's and Clark's house west of Tucson. In those days, it wasn't in the city limits and it was out in the desert. And then over the next 2 or 3 days, Clark and I were able to get Ed to undergo what they call a laparotomy, which is a bummer of an operation where it's like this. They make an incision like that, and then they fold down the top layer and look at the organs inside and see what's wrong in there. And there was no cancer. But they did discover what they called esophageal varices, which I'd never heard of, and neither Clark nor I paid much heed to it. We learned that Ed was okay. He wasn't going to die in 2 months of pancreatic cancer. And we started hooping and hollering and carrying on. And then it was revealed that the problem with this thing called esophageal varices, which is ostensibly related to alcoholism, and Ed was not an alcoholic. I mean, he would drink, but he didn't need it. He would drink every now and then. When he and I were together, we'd drink beer if we run in a river or something. But when he'd break up with a wife, say, when he broke up with one of his wives, he came by and drank a lot of hard alcohol. So who knows? But at any rate, as I understand it, and I may be wrong, the esophageal artery thromboses and a cluster of smaller veins. I don't know whether it's a vein or an artery, but at any rate, they were weak-walled and would hemorrhage. And that's eventually what got him. And he started having bleeds in 1984. Yeah. And so Kath and I rented our house out in Santa Fe and used the money to rent a house down in Tucson. And we spent that winter there and hung out with Ed a lot, just, trying to be there for him. And we had a lot of good conversations then, too. And then he finished Hey Duke Lives in 1989, early March 1989. And he called me up. He said, let's go camping. I just finished it. And I said, okay. And it was too late to leave that day. So I said, I'll take off. I'll start driving tomorrow morning. And then we can take off. And how did that go? I got there, that's right. And I got there too late for us to go camping. We had a place we were going to camp that we'd never camped before. And in the middle of the night, I was sleeping. The way their house was, they had this house, and then down the hill, maybe up to 100 yards down the hill, toward the Arroyo, was where Ed's writing cabin was. And that's where I was staying. And Clark came in the middle of the night, said, Jack, you got to get Ed to the hospital, he's bleeding. So we climbed in the car, and this was maybe 3:30 or 4 in the morning, and I was driving. The hospital was on the far side of town, on the east side of town. And at one point, Ed said, stop, and I stopped. He said, let's just go out in the desert and get it over with. And I said, this is entirely your call. I'm here to do what you want to do. And he sat there and he thought about it, and he thought about, maybe I have a chance of surviving this one. 2 little kids. Let's go to the hospital. So I did. And he was in the hospital for a couple of days, and then I went in, and Clark and I went in together. And by this time, I think her folks had come down. Tom and Carolyn, her mother and dad. And he said to us, I'm not going to make it. I can tell I'm not going to make it this time. But there was an operation they could do, which would be called a portal shunt. And, but that same night, he said, I got to get out of here. And so that's when I swiped the lady's wheelchair and wheeled him out of the hospital. And then I wanted to give them some space because
Have a family conversation.
Yeah.
A family care.
and I said, I'm going to go move into a motel so you guys have total space. And I didn't tell anybody which one. And he started to bleed again that night. And Clark was mightily PO'd at me the next morning because she couldn't get me to help him get to the hospital. So she called up Dave and Nancy, Dave Foreman.
Mm-hmm.
So they got him to the hospital. But Dave and Nancy were supposed to be on this. They were leaving the next day for another trip.
Mm-hmm.
And so got him into the hospital, and we had been told about this operation called a portal shunt, which would make an artificial, whatever it is, artery or vein between the esophagus and the liver,
Mm-hmm.
and that could save him. And so he finally agreed to have that operation, and they did it, and it was a success. But he was, by this time, having tubes pulled up and down his esophagus. He was bleeding, and there was no way they could stop it. And so that's when, by this time, Doug Peacock was also there.
Mm-hmm.
And so was Steve Prescott and Susan. Susan's Clark's sister. And it was Susan and Clark, Tom and Carolyn and Peacock and me. And I was getting blood illicitly with this blood type from a guy, and to keep him alive, just to keep stuff going in.
How did that work? Like,
Trickily.
yeah, you just like.
I said, I need blood, man. Give me some blood.
And he just.
And it was a guy who, I let him know it was necessary, and he knew it anyway. So I won't give his name.
Yeah, you know.
And so anyway, I was bringing over blood, and both Steve was an MD, and Peacock was a medic at Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, he went through some stuff, I'll tell you. I haven't seen Peacock in a long time, but I've always felt that if it hit the fan big time, he and I knew we were okay back to back.
Right.
And
he's the guy you wanted in your foxhole.
Yeah, absolutely. But boy, anyway, I could tell it was on his way out. And so I would sit with him for hours, or Susie would. And the next morning, after days went by, a couple of days, I could hear in his breathing that he wasn't going to last long. But I said, I'll go get one more slug of blood. And I went off to the hospital to get it. And I called the house, and I talked to Susan, Clark's sister. She said, Jack, Ed just died. And so the day before, this sounds awful, but it's the way it goes, I stopped by an ice plant and asked if I could make sure that they had enough ice to keep 200 pounds of meat fresh for a couple of days. And so the first stop was the same doctor to get the blood. And I said, I don't need the blood. I need a death certificate. He said, I can't give you one of those. And I said, man, I need this death certificate.
We got to make this legit.
And
We got to
so-
get some paperwork here.
So on the way back with the death certificate, I picked up 200 pounds of dry ice. And we packed up he was in a sleeping bag, and we put him in a body bag then and put ice around him to keep him fresh. And then we stashed him in the back of my pickup truck. And then I filled out the death certificate, and that was something you're not supposed to do unless you're an MD.
Right.
But I could tell he was dead, you know.
Yeah, you don't need
And so
to go to medical school to
And so I knew, and Peacock had taken off. He needed to be alone for a little bit. And he came back. And so Peacock and Steve went in Peacock's car, and Tom, Clark's dad, and I climbed in my truck, and we had Ed in the back. And away we went.
And everyone was just like this is what was on the mission, I guess, so
Yeah.
to speak. They knew Ed wanted this, and your group of 4 was there to execute on
Yeah,
it.
and then when Dave died, Foreman, a year ago last September, they were sounding me, how do you deal with stuff like this? Because I sort of became an authority on what you do.
Oh, right. Did they do something similar for him?
Well, he wanted himself just taken out in the wilderness somewhere,
Right.
laid on top of the ground, let the animals consume him.
There's this whole other issue here around death and how, even it's commodified now.
Yeah, well, he ended up being, I said, you need at least 4 guys under 60 to do this, because it takes endurance to deal with carrying a body a long way from where you can park. I remember we had Ed sleeping in his sleeping bag, and we each had the corner. We had 2 shovels, and we had them on 2 shovels.
Right.
And that's the way we.
50 pounds each, basically.
Yeah.
Without the ice.
And away we went. And it takes a lot of chops, man. It really does. And then you got to dig the hole, and that was a whole trip into its own. And
while you're processing this emotional connection to
we
person.
were on a mission.
Yeah. So you're just like,
Yep. And
follow the plan.
And we did it. And we made a solemn vow that none of us would ever reveal where he was. And
Ed wanted that. Or I guess it has to be that way, right?
Yeah, I was imagining people wanting to dig up the body and taking his forefinger or something.
Right.
And
or making it an industrial tourist site.
Yeah, and he was illegally buried.
Right.
And but on public land. Anyway, it was done as best we could do, and we poured a bottle of tequila or something in the grave. Both Peacock and I got in the grave and tested it to make sure it was comfy. And I remember when I was laying in the grave, I saw 2 birds. I saw a turkey vulture, and I saw a red-tailed hawk. And I looked at the vulture and said, not yet. I've had this relationship with vultures.
Yeah.
There's a whole roost right across, and they're here in the summertime, about 200 yards from here. But at any rate, then we drove back, and we had gotten out in the nick of time because another friend of Ed's who had been told, they called and told him, I won't give his name, called the press.
Okay.
And we missed the press by about 10 minutes.
That would have been a mess.
And we were all just totally exhausted. Because I'd been awake for a week, and Peacock had been mostly awake for a week. He got there about 3 days after I did.
So what was going through your mind while you're driving down the road to this secret place with Ed in the back? Like, were you afraid you were going to get pulled over? Were you paranoid at all about?
Well,
or were you just focused?
I figured the way I had Ed's body in the back of the truck was under this. I built a bed frame with my sleeping mat on top of it, and there was about this much space beneath the bed, just enough to slide Ed under it, so they would really have to be looking for him.
Right.
But I had this death certificate, and I filled out another paper transportation, all of which was totally illegal.
You're like, you had
But
an
who
alibi.
cares, man?
Yeah.
You're doing what your buddy wanted you to do. So we did. And
it sounds like you're trying to get the paperwork in line as best you could.
well, so that
to
we did
protect
get
your-
stopped.
Yeah, to protect yourself.
But I didn't realize I was doing an illegal act by filling out
Right.
and signing the death certificate.
I mean, you hadn't slept for a week. You gotta give you.
But it was.
But I mean, did you have any idea when you made this promise 10 years before that it was all going to go down this way?
Well, I didn't know. I said to him at the time, "You're 9.5 years older than me, so I'm going to be doing all the work.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you sail off into the sunset, And but it was cool because I mean, we were friends, and really a great friend. Boy. Anyway, we did it. Everybody was wasted. A week later, Clark, a bunch of us put together the first wake, I guess you'd call it, in Saguaro National Monument on the east side of Santa Fe, Tucson.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of fun, and I played taps, and that was the last time I ever played the trumpet in public.
It's just kind of your way of...
Well, it was time. I mean, I figured what was I? I was in my early 50s by then, nearly 54. And to be a real jazz player needs heavy-duty endurance, the kind of jazz I like to play. And I just didn't, and if I couldn't play like that, I didn't want to.
Yeah, you didn't want to.
And I figured this is as good a place as any. So I did it. And I think we had some slow elk brought to us by Brother Peacock. Yeah. And Hoots was there. Hoots was Howard Abbey, Ed's brother, one of his brothers. And it was a really good one. There was another one in Moab, but I didn't go to that. But when I went back, 2014 was it? Yeah, I went back to spend some time with Wendell Berry back in Kentucky, because Wendell, Ken Kesey, Larry McMurtry, and Ed Abbey all took a course with Wallace Stegner in creative writing at the University in Santa Cruz, I think. That's where that was. I'd have to read my book, but and Wendell had gone to the one in Moab because he really liked Abbey a lot, and he read me. Boy, it was really neat. I've got it somewhere, the recording of it. I recorded Wendell reading Wallace Stegner's thing that he asked Wendell to read at that second Moab event. And it was really heartwarming. And boy, Wendell's still alive. I've got a bunch of his books. He became a friend. And his best friend is a guy named Wes Jackson, whom I mentioned earlier, who founded the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. But anyway, after that was over, it just, the people who were really good friends of Ed, we really knew each other. And there aren't many left. Steve Prescott died within the last 2 or 3 years. Tom Cartwright died within the last 10 years, I think. I have a photo, the 20th anniversary of the gang, the burial group that Clark took of us in Moab. And I don't know where that is anymore, but the only two left are Peacock and me. And I have to hand it to, his name escaped me. I like him very much. The guy who did the book Finding Abbey.
Oh, Sean Prentice.
Yeah, who's a close, I guess, John Hustorfer's best friend.
Yeah.
And
both those guys are very influential to me.
And I liked him, and he had the super good taste to not ask me to tell him where Ed was buried.
Yeah.
And of course I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
But he found him. I know other people have.
Mm-hmm.
Because the only person I've taken out there is Clark, his widow. I
That
figured
makes
that was
sense.
appropriate.
Yeah.
And we got a rock because Ed wanted his headstone. So we got a piece of rock that was appropriate from that area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we took it back to town and got it. Edward Paul Abbey, 1927, 1989, no comment.
No comment. And brought it back out.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, one of the other thing that's coming up for me just hearing you tell this story and going back to some of the other themes that have come up in the interview is this idea of trust. And now you have, not only was there's this piece of you, going way out of your way in a situation that wasn't reciprocal at this point. Like Ed could never pay you back.
Oh, you don't think like that?
And yet you're just doing this selflessly. And now you're, you have this secret you're carrying, to the end of your life of, this place of burial. And it's unique, and I find it fascinating, and I find it very beautiful because death is so
Permanent.
it's permanent.
It's terminal.
It's the end for everybody. Everybody's gonna go. Everyone's gonna die. I'm gonna die. You're gonna die. My precious child's gonna die. Hopefully that happens long after I'm gone.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And yet, I think for so many people they put it off because they're so afraid of it. And then it just like happens and there's no paperwork, and then they just kind of follow whatever traditional path is in line with their culture. And this is wildly different. I feel like, Ed knew what he wanted, how he wanted to be buried and have his ending. And then I see him as being very lucky to have you to help execute on it.
I don't see it. Just friends, real friends, do what they do.
Right, and maybe I don't. I wish I had more friends like Ed. You were to Ed in my life, and I don't. Maybe it's a generational thing. I can't think of anybody in my life who would do something like that for me. In this time period, in this milieu, to use your word, it's a hard thing.
Well, people were going to have done it with Dave Foreman.
Yeah.
And then I got to thinking, and I don't know to whom I sent this note, and I know it had to have nothing to do with the final outcome, but I remember that Dave had a bunch of screws in his back, and I had this vision of a coyote breaking a tooth on a screw. And I wrote this to somebody, but they finally, Dave, his second option was to be cremated and have his ashes mixed with Nancy's, because she died of Lou Gehrig's disease. She got that, which is a bummer.
Mm-hmm.
And but I frankly don't care. I mean, I figure when you're dead, that's that. And I'd thought about earlier on when I still could hike, 15 miles a day, of having found the cave and hiking out with 5 gallons of water and just
right.
Yeah, and but I didn't, and that's like when Ed died, man. I mean, there were a heck of a lot fewer of us on the planet than there are now.
Right.
And I never got a permit to run a river.
Yeah.
Ever.
Oh, that's crazy. Yeah.
I would just run them.
Yeah.
And I got busted a couple of times. And one time I got busted and fined $100 for tearing down the sign that said, "Write down where you want to camp" on the San Juan. And the judge fined me $100 and said I would have done the same thing. He was an old guy like me.
Going back to consciousness real quick, do you think after you die, your consciousness will live on at all?
Who knows? I'm not concerned one way or the other.
Yeah, you're at peace.
I've always been at peace. I've never been a Christian.
Yeah.
I've never have. I've got friends who are Buddhists, Zen Buddhists, and Gary Snyder's been one all his life. I've got my good friend Gary Nabhan is a Franciscan monk, married, but nonetheless he's a Franciscan. And everybody has their own way of dealing with it. I'm simply, the flow of nature will do whatever it does.
Right.
And that's exactly as it should be. Otherwise, boy, I think I'm really, like that photograph I showed you when we first got here, I'm really looking forward to all sorts of good stuff from the James Webb telescope.
Right.
I took a course in astronomy in college. That was one of the few that I really dug.
Yeah.
And anyway, I think that looking at a photograph wherein there are thousands of galaxies visible, some of them very minutely so, but nonetheless there. And ostensibly, from the point of view of the Webb telescope, the view through the hole was the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length.
Right.
And so that's what we're looking at in the night sky in that photograph.
Yeah, and it's still such a deep field.
Yeah, and there are thousands of galaxies in that grain of sand's worth of whatever you call it, aperture.
Mm-hmm.
And or at least that's what it said.
Yeah, sure.
And so whatever, that puts things in real perspective, man.
Absolutely.
So I just am thankful to have gotten a crack at life because I've tried to give it my best shot, and that's all you can do.